Did you know that back in the early 90s, like over half of all women said they'd experienced some kind of harassment at work?
It's a crazy statistic, and sadly, a lot of people still deal with this today.
Yeah, it's awful. And today we're looking into a case that shows this problem in a really tragic way.
Ugh.
The unsolved murder of Susan Terrascowitz.
Yeah, this case shows us like the dark side of what can happen at work, but also what can happen when you speak up against what's wrong. Susan's story, and we'll be looking at witness statements, police reports, and interviews. It shows us that standing up for what's right can sometimes be really dangerous.
I think a lot of our listeners can relate to this story, especially if they've been through something similar at work.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So Susan, or Sue as people called her, she was a young woman full of life working as a ramp supervisor at Boston Logan Airport back in the early 90s.
So like early 90s.
Yep, early 90s. She loved her job, always smiling. Everyone knew her for her Snoopy collection. She was just a bright light.
It's hard to believe that someone so full of life could have such a terrible ending. So let's go back to September 14th, 1992, the day Sue disappeared.
Yeah, the details of that day are really disturbing. It started like any other day, but when Sue didn't show up for her shift, her family knew something was very wrong. She never missed work, especially without calling.
Right.
Her sister Debbie even got 2 calls from Sue's supervisor.
2 calls.
Yeah. The second one was basically telling them to file a missing person report.
That's strange that the supervisor called twice. It's like he really wanted the police involved right away. Do we know why he acted that way?
That's a good question. And honestly, the information we have doesn't explain the supervisor's motives,
Yeah.
but it definitely makes you wonder what he knew or suspected.
Yeah, okay. So the supervisor's pushing for a police report, and then while Sue's mother, Marlene, is at the police station actually filing the report, they hear about a terrible discovery at an auto body shop near the airport.
Yeah, and this part of the police report is really scary. An employee from a nearby business saw blood dripping from the trunk of a car, and they found Sue's body inside.
Oh my gosh.
It was really violent, multiple stab wounds, a fractured skull. It looked like she put up a fight. This wasn't just random, it was personal and full of anger.
That's just heartbreaking.
Yeah.
Was this auto body shop a random location, or did it mean something to Sue?
It's interesting you asked that because Sue knew that area. She often went to a restaurant right next door, and she sometimes parked in the shop slot,
Okay.
though not usually when she was working. So it seems like she might have been taken somewhere else first and then moved to the auto body shop.
So the question is, what happened to Sue between leaving work and ending up in her car at that shop?
hmm
And is it connected to the problem she was having at work?
The last anyone saw her was at work when she offered to get sandwiches for her crew from a restaurant nearby. She just never came back.
Was she just left to get sandwiches and disappeared? Was there any security footage or witnesses?
Yeah. No, not that we know of. And what makes it even weirder is that one of her coworkers clocked her out and then back in thinking she'd just been delayed.
Oh, wow.
The police eventually cleared him, but it makes you think about how security was at the airport back then.
Yeah, that seems like a big problem, especially since Sue had reported being harassed by some of her male coworkers.
Right, and this wasn't just teasing or gossips. Sue actually filed a formal complaint with her union because she was passed over for a promotion, and she thought it was because she was a woman.
So she was already facing pushback for challenging the way things were in a job that's usually dominated by men. And it sounds like the harassment went beyond just arguments at work.
Absolutely. Imagine the stress of constantly feeling like you're in danger at work. Sue had to deal with her car being vandalized, threatening phone calls both at work and at home, and even times when people tried to intimidate her physically.
Did the police look into these incidents when she reported them?
That's where it gets even worse. It doesn't seem like her complaints were taken seriously enough. It wasn't until a year after her death that her mother found Sue's diary.
Diary.
Yeah, and it described all the horrible things that were happening to her.
Wow. A diary discovered a year later. It seems like the initial investigation missed a big opportunity.
It does raise questions about how thorough they were. This diary wasn't just some vague complaints, it had specifics. Like, there was a drawing of a coffin with her name on it found in her locker, and another entry talked about a coworker smashing her radio because he was angry.
Those details are really disturbing. They paint a picture of a workplace that was not only hostile, but dangerous. So I'm guessing the diary became really important to the investigation.
Absolutely. It made them focus on the harassment she went through, and it showed how things were getting worse.
Hmm.
And here's where it gets more complicated. It turns out some of the men harassing Sue were involved in a huge credit card fraud ring that was operating right out of Logan Airport.
So we have a bad work environment, A possible reason for someone to want Sue quiet, and a criminal operation happening at the airport. Did investigators think these things were connected?
That became the big question. Was Sue's murder just a tragic result of a hostile workplace, or was it connected to the credit card ring? Were they afraid she would expose them, or did she get caught in the middle of something?
It's a very tangled situation. So
Yeah.
I'm guessing they had a few people they were looking at as suspects.
Yeah, and each suspect had their own issues.
Mm.
At first, they focused on Sue's ex-boyfriend, Al Wanders. He didn't want to talk to the police at first, which obviously made them suspicious.
Yeah, not cooperating with the police never looks good.
Right. But he eventually gave them an alibi, and it checked out. Then there was a coworker, Frank, who had feelings for Sue. He became a person of interest because of a strange phone call Sue got the night she disappeared.
A strange phone call. What was strange about it?
We don't know much. They couldn't trace it, but a friend of Sue's said that Sue got a call on call waiting while they were talking that night, and after the call, Sue seemed upset. But Frank also cooperated with the police and had a solid alibi for the time of the murder.
So 2 potential suspects cleared. Were there any other leads?
They started focusing on 2 coworkers, Joseph Nusso and Robert Brooks, who had a history of harassing Sue. They were actually fired and then rehired later after they appealed their termination.
Wait, so they were fired for harassing Sue, but then allowed to come back to work? How did that happen?
They were part of the union and they were allowed to return to work after some kind of probation agreement. It's not really clear from what we know what the agreement said or how it affected Sue, but it makes you wonder if anyone really cared about her safety.
That's a really important point. It seems like there were some serious problems with the way the airport was run.
Yes, and these problems are even bigger when you think about the fact that both Joseph and Robert were very involved in the credit card ring. Joseph especially had a history of violence and had even threatened Sue before.
So he had a motive, he was involved in crime, he was violent, and he had threatened her before.
Exactly. And there's another part of this story that adds even more mystery: the missing Snoopy necklace.
A missing necklace. What's so important about that?
Sue loved Snoopy. Remember, she collected Snoopy stuff. She always wore this specific necklace, a gold chain with charms, including a Snoopy and a crucifix. When the police found her body, the clasp of the necklace was in the car, but the necklace was gone.
Do they think the killer took it?
It's definitely possible investigators think it might have been taken as a trophy or even as proof that she was murdered.
That's a scary thought.
Yeah.
And it adds a whole new layer of this already complicated case. So we have a missing necklace, maybe connected to the killer. We have several suspects, each connected to the harassment Sue endured and the criminal activity at the airport. Where did the investigation go from here?
Yeah, the case went cold for a bit, but then a new detective, Lieutenant Murphy, took it over. He was determined to get justice for Sue, and he had some new ideas about the case.
It's good to hear about someone so dedicated to finding the truth even years later. What did Lieutenant Murphy do differently?
He looked at all the evidence again, talked to the important witnesses again, and came up with his own theory about what happened to Sue. He thought her murder was directly tied to that credit card ring, and that someone in the ring might have thought she was informing on them.
But her mother and even the feds said she wasn't involved in the investigation.
That's right. But even if it wasn't true, just the idea that she was an informant could have been enough to get her killed. Murphy figured that Sue, already scared from all the harassment, might have panicked when they confronted her, and that led to a struggle and then her death.
So maybe it was a crime that happened in the moment, fueled by paranoia and fear. Makes you wonder if those guys ever meant to kill her or if things just got out of control.
Yeah, that's one of the big questions that we still don't have an answer to. So Murphy's theory put the focus back on the men involved in both the harassment and the credit card ring. He talked to Al again, and like we said, Al had a solid alibi. Joseph Nusso, though he was a key player in both the harassment and the ring, he stayed a main suspect.
Did Murphy ever get a confession or any solid proof that Joseph was involved?
Even though they questioned him a bunch of times, Joseph insisted he had nothing to do with it. But there was something else that came up during this new investigation. Remember Robert Brooks, the coworker fired with Joseph for harassing Sue?
Yeah, the one working at a different airport when Sue was killed?
Right. Well, they found phone records showing he'd been talking to Joseph on the day Sue was murdered. And get this, he lied under oath about how many times they talked.
So he lied, and that lie connected him to Joseph on the day of the murder. That's huge.
It is. That led to Robert being charged with perjury and obstructing justice. He ended up pleading guilty and served time, but he was never charged with anything to do with Sue's murder.
It's frustrating that he didn't have to tell them more about what he knew, especially since he was connected to Joseph and lied about their calls.
Yeah.
Did they ever find out what they talked about on the phone that day?
Nope, that's still a mystery. But during Robert's trial for perjury, we learned that Joseph thought Sue was the one telling on them about the credit card stuff. He'd even threatened to kill her.
So we know Joseph, a known harasser with a history of violence, had a reason to want Sue silenced. But there's still no confession and no direct evidence putting him at the crime scene.
That's right. Even without that smoking gun, Lieutenant Murphy was sure they were close to the truth. He kept working on the case even after he retired from the police. He'd promised Sue's mother that he'd find her daughter's killer.
Wow, that shows real dedication.
Mm.
It's clear that he really cared about solving this case. Speaking of Sue's mother, Marlene, how did she handle this horrible loss and the fact that there were no answers?
Marlene's story is amazing. It's about strength and never giving up. She turned her grief into action and became a huge advocate for her daughter. She spent years looking over case files, doing her own interviews, and even going to prisons to talk to possible witnesses.
She didn't just wait for the police to figure it out. She took charge. That's
Wow.
incredible.
It is. Marlene's determination is really inspiring. She talks about how Sue, even as a young woman, wasn't afraid to stand up for what she believed in, even in a job where men were mostly in charge. And Marlene's doing the same thing. She won't let people forget about her daughter.
Their bond must have been so strong. I remember reading about how Marlene contacted Charles Schultz, the guy who created Peanuts, to get a special Snoopy drawing for Sue's memorial plaque.
That's such a touching detail. It shows how close they were and how much Sue loved Snoopy. It also makes us think about that missing Snoopy necklace.
Right, the necklace that was ripped from her neck, leaving just the clasp. It makes you think, did the killer understand how important that necklace was? Was it just a random theft? Or was it supposed to be a message, a way to hurt her family even more?
That question has been hanging over the investigation for years. Was it a cruel act by a scared criminal, or something more twisted, a symbol of power and control? We might never know for sure.
But there's still hope, right? With all the new DNA technology, maybe they can match the evidence from the crime scene.
That's what Lieutenant Murphy and Marlene are hoping for. And don't forget, there's still a $250,000 reward for information leading to the arrest and conviction of Sue's killer.
That's a lot of money.
Yeah.
But more importantly, it's a chance to bring closure to a case that's been haunting a family and a community for decades.
Exactly. Maybe someone listening knows something, a detail they thought didn't matter, that could help break the case wide open.
It shows that sometimes justice depends on people being brave enough to come forward to tell the truth and to help bring closure to a case that's caused so much pain for so long.
And it shows the power of never giving up, both from dedicated investigators like Lieutenant Murphy and from family members like Marlene. They won't let Sue's story fade away, and their search for the truth gives us all hope that even the most difficult and heartbreaking cases can be solved eventually.
Before we go to the last part of our deep dive, I want to think for a minute about how this case has affected everyone. We've talked about Sue's tragic death, her mother's tireless work, and the dedication of the investigators. But there's another part of this story that we haven't talked about yet. What about the workplace itself?
That's a good point. Susan's case forced Logan Airport and the whole airline industry to face some hard truths. It showed everyone how big the problem of workplace harassment was, especially for women, and how often people in charge didn't do enough about it.
It reminds us that these problems aren't just about individual cases. They're bigger issues that need bigger solutions.
Exactly. And while we've made progress in dealing with workplace harassment since Susan's murder, her story shows us that we can't stop fighting. We have to keep challenging bad behavior, support those who speak up, and make sure those who do wrong are held accountable.
It's about making a culture where everyone feels safe, respected, and valued, no matter who they are or what their job is.
That's it. And it's about understanding that staying silent can sometimes mean you're part of the problem. We all have a part to play in making a world that's fairer and more just both at work and everywhere else.
Now, with that in mind, let's move on to the final part of our deep dive. We'll look at what's being done to solve Susan's case and the lasting impact her story has had on those who knew her and those who are still fighting for justice in her name. It's been almost 30 years since Susan Terrascowitz was murdered, but her story still matters. It reminds us to speak out against injustice, and it shows how long the road to healing can be for those left behind.
It's really something that even after all this time, people haven't given up hope for justice. Lieutenant Murphy, even though he's retired, is still trying to solve this case. He thinks all the new DNA technology might be the key to finally finding the evidence to put Sue's killer away.
That's pretty amazing to think that after all these years, there could still be new evidence that could lead to someone being convicted. It gives you hope not just for Susan and her family, but for anyone who's been affected by an unsolved crime.
It shows you what can happen when you don't give up, and how important it is to keep searching for the truth no matter how much time has passed.
And it's not just the investigators. Marlene Susan's mother has spent her life keeping her daughter's memory alive and fighting for justice.
She's incredibly strong and determined. It's really inspiring. She's become a voice for other families who are dealing with unsolved murders, too. She wants more resources and support for these cold cases.
It reminds us that for families like Susan's, the pain doesn't just go away. The not knowing, the lack of closure, it's got to be so hard.
Marlene often says that finding Susan's killer won't bring her daughter back, but at least it would give her some peace knowing that justice was done.
And that feeling of justice isn't just for Susan and her family, it's for everyone. It's about making sure that people who do terrible things are held accountable, and that other people are protected from becoming victims.
Exactly. Susan's case is like a warning. It shows what can happen when we ignore injustice, when we look the other way. It makes us think about our own actions, our own workplaces, and our communities.
I think if we've learned anything from this deep dive, it's that we can't stay silent. We have to speak up against harassment, discrimination, and violence whenever we see it.
And we have to support people who are brave enough to come forward and tell their stories even when it's hard.
Because even something small, a detail someone might not think is important, could be the thing that helps uncover the truth. And in Susan's case, there's a big reason for anyone with information to come forward.
Right. There's a $250,000 reward for information that leads to the arrest and conviction of Susan Terrascowitz's killer.
That's a huge amount of money. But more importantly, it's a chance to finally bring closure to a case that's been unsolved for decades.
If you're listening and you know anything at all about what happened to Susan, please call the Massachusetts State Police. The number is 617-727-8817. Your call might be the one that finally brings justice for Susan.
It could be the missing piece that helps investigators find the killer and bring peace to Susan's family and friends.
Susan's story is a tragedy, but it's also a story of resilience, love, and the unwavering pursuit of truth. Her case may be unsolved, but her memory lives on, and it inspires us to fight for justice, to speak truth to power, and to work towards a world where these kinds of terrible things don't happen anymore.
It's a powerful reminder that even in the darkest times, hope and the search for justice can win. And sometimes it just takes one person, one voice to make all the difference.
If you liked this deep dive into the unsolved murder of Susan Terrascowitz, make sure you subscribe to the Deep Dive for more stories like this. We research them carefully and present them just for you. Until next time, keep learning and keep asking questions.